Okay, so the last lesson that you guys are going to see this week still has to do with solving quadratics. However, we are not going to use factoring today. We're not going to use completing the square. We're finally going to use the last way, which is the quadratic formula. All right, now, again, this is something that I treat it as a last resort. You can solve every single quadratic this way to find what values would make the whole quadratic turn into 0. However, factoring you're going to see is much quicker. Even completing the square, I know that it was a process yesterday, but even with completing the square, as you get better at that, you'll start to get faster at that and get quicker. So quadratic formula has a lot of steps, but it is nice because no matter what I give you in terms of A, B, and C in standard form, you can plug it into this, do the algebra, and then find your answer. Okay, so this I treat as our kind of last resort, the quadratic formula. Now, you do have to memorize the quadratic formula. All right, you do have to memorize it. So it's just one of those things that you gotta know it. So the way that we've done in the past is we do a little song. And you guys know the tune, hopefully, Pop Goes the Weasel. So we'll go and I'll just sing it real quick. And don't worry, next week when I'm back, we'll have many singing sessions we can practice. All right, so here we go. X is equal to the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a. All right, there you go. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, so let's use this to solve an example problem. All right, so again, we must have it in standard form. And if you forgot standard form, that is ax squared plus bx plus c. All right, which is, we do have that here. So our a value is 1. There's no number in front of x squared, so it's 1. B is 10, and c is 2. All right, and so we're going to just write down the quadratic formula. All right, so here we go. X is equal to the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a. And it's just, you just start to memorize it. Okay, so there's the formula. So everywhere where it says a, it's going to become a 1. Everywhere it says b, it's going to become a 10. And so on and so forth. C is 2. So that's how we're going to solve this here. So I'll go and use blue to solve by plugging these numbers in. So I have x equals. Now, you can write the opposite of 10, but the way I just think of this, every time I do it, it says if b is 10, well, what is the opposite of 10? Negative 10. So that's what I write first. Times the square root of 10 squared. Notice the parentheses. You don't want to get in trouble here, so make sure you have the parentheses in the right place. Minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 2. That's all over the whole thing divided by 2 times 1. All right, so at this point, all it becomes is just, can you simplify it? So this is kind of like our first checkpoint. All right, can you get all of the numbers in the right place? So let's see if we can simplify this. You always start by simplifying underneath the radical. So negative 10 plus or minus 10 squared is going to be 100 minus, what is 4 times 1 times 2? That's going to be 8. All divided by, and then I can simplify actually 2 times 1 to just be 2. All right? So the last part here to get the actual answer is going to be to subtract 100 minus 8. So I have negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 92 divided by 2. Now again, this is the answer. All right? This is the answer. However, all right, you can simplify this even further, but I just want to pause here so that way you can take a look at your work and see that this is, in fact, the answer. All right, if I were to plug in the calculator, negative 10 plus the square root of 92 and then divide that by 2, I'd get one answer. If I did negative 10 minus the square root of 92 and then divide that by 2, I'd get my second answer. Both of those would make this quadratic become 0. All right, so that's the whole point here. Now, if you want to get the actual simplified answer, this is where you're going to need to simplify that square root, right? So this square root of 92 has a perfect square in it. So again, if you have your calculator, it can do it for you. But the square root of 92 has a 4 in it. All right, the factors of 92 are 4 times 23. So that's why we're going to write x equals negative 10 plus or minus, and when you take the 4 out, it becomes 2 times the square root of 23 over 2. So again, I have not changed anything. All right, yes, I've simplified, but even if now I plugged this into the calculator, I would get the same numbers. So nothing has changed. And the one last step to simplify is you look at these three numbers, negative 10, 2, and 2. Notice I did not circle what is inside the radical. That's not going to change. But all three of those numbers can divide by 2. So I'm going to write negative 5 plus or minus. You could put a 1 next to the square root of 23, but you don't need to. And you could put it all over 1, but again, you don't need to. So this right here is the answer for solving this quadratic. Now, I'm just going to pause for a second so you can look at that, right? Because our denominator ended up becoming 1, I didn't write it over 1, and you should hopefully see that this is the same form as yesterday with completing the square. All right, so using completing the square, using quadratic formula, yes, they're different processes, but you get something that is similar. All right? We didn't have to worry about factoring here or anything like that. We just used the quadratic formula. But the answer form is the same. Now, if I asked you to go on the calculator and actually do negative 5 plus the square root of 23, you would get, let's see, negative 5 plus the square root of 23. You would get negative point, I'm just going to round here to, let's just go 3 after the decimal, 204. Or if I did negative 5 plus the square root of 23, you would get, oh, not minus, I want plus. Wait, hold on 1 second. Sorry, technical difficulties. Negative 5 plus the square root of 23. Okay, and that's what I got. All right, so now we do negative 5 minus the square root of 23. So I get both here. There we go. There's the other one. I'll put it in the correct order here. Negative 9.796. And the other one, which was negative 0.204. Again, just rounding. So these two numbers, if you were to take these two numbers and plug them back into the original, way up here, into the original x values, right, then you should see that you wouldn't get exactly 0 because I rounded, but you'd get basically 0. So those are the two answers. Again, what I have boxed is what I expect to see on any quiz or test. So what I have boxed, the step afterwards is something that's going to help you when you get to pre-calculus, okay? So that's the first example here for the quadratic formula. A lot of stuff, so that's why I said I treat this as a last resort, because I can do factoring and completing the square much faster, okay? But this always works. Let's try a second example here. We have A is 2, B is negative 16, and C is 27. All right, so I'm going to do x is equal to the opposite of B, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all over 2A. All right, so I'm going to write x equals, and here's where I'm going to do the opposite of negative 16. So in my mind, the opposite of negative 16 is 16, plus or minus the square root of negative 16 squared minus 4 times 2 times 27. All right, and that's all over 2 times 2. So again, this is your first checkpoint. Can you plug all the numbers in to the right spot? So that's kind of the first step. If you don't do this right, then you won't be successful as you simplify further down. All right, so just take a second, make sure you have everything in the right spot. The b squared, make sure you notice in the parentheses my negative sign. If you notice right here in my parentheses, put a little arrow here, right? In my parentheses, the negative sign is inside the parentheses, So if you, in the calculator, if you don't use parentheses and you write negative 16 squared, it is going to give you a negative number. So make sure, if you're using the calculator, to be aware of that. All right, so now we're just going to simplify. So I have x equals 16 plus or minus, and then you want to simplify in the radical first. Okay, so in the radical first is going to give you 16 squared, which is 256. So you want to go have 256 minus, and then you're going to write 4 times 2 times 27, which is, if I use the calculator, that's going to be 216. 216. All right, all over, and I can simplify 2 times 2, which is 4. So x equals 16 plus or minus the square root of, and 256 minus 216 is 40, all over 4. So again, I am done. This is it. That is the answer. However, because I can simplify the square root of 40, that's not the simplified answer that I'm going to look for. But in terms of if I plug this into my calculator, I would get the two numbers that make this quadratic become 0. So again, now it's just going to be simplifying. The square root of 40 has factors 10 and 4. So if I take out that square root of 4, I get 2 times the square root of 10 all over 4. And then those three numbers, if you look at those three numbers, 16, 2, and 4, again, I am not circling what's inside the radical. All three of those can divide by 2. You can only divide out the lowest number, right? 16, 4, and 2. 2 is the lowest, so I can only divide them all by 2. So 8 plus or minus, I could write a 1 if you wanted to, times the square root of 10 all over 2. So that is it. This is my answer. You need to fight the urge. There's going to be a lot of students that want to divide that 10 and that 2. Do not do that. Leave it like this. Do not touch the number that's in that radical. So if you were to take your calculator and do 8 plus the square root of 10 and then divide that by 2, you would get 5.581. So that's one of them. X equals 5.581. If I did the other one, 8 minus the square root of 10 and divide that by 2, you would get the other one, which is 2.419. So those are the two answers. Approximately 2.419, and the other one that I said was 5.581. Again, this step here is not necessary, but I'm just showing you how you can use the calculator to find decimal approximations if that makes you feel better. All right, so all of that to find the two solutions for this quadratic. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pause here.